sought political asylum from the West because they realized that if they were returned to Russia, they would be shot as traitors. Over 6 million soldiers and other anti-communists pleaded with the American government not to be sent back to Russia. And all 6 million people were sent back to Russia to certain death. This operation was called Operation Keelhaul and is covered in this book by Jules Epstein called simply Operation Keelhaul. Mr. Epstein says that it was General Dwight Eisenhower who issued the orders to return these anti-communists to Russia. It can be demonstrated that General Eisenhower knew that these people would be shot by the communist government of Russia. He knew, Eisenhower knew when he sent them back, that sending them back was certain death. Many years later, when the court sentenced the German Adolf Eichmann for war crimes during World War II for gassing the Jews at the concentration camps, the judge said this, number 20. The legal and moral responsibility of him who delivers the victim to his death is no smaller and may even be greater than the liability of him who does the victim to death. General Dwight Eisenhower sent 6 million people to certain death in communist Russia, yet no court ever said that Eisenhower was guilty of any crime. I guess it is all in which side you are on once the war is over, the winning or the losing. Eichmann was sentenced to death. Eisenhower became president of the United States. And even Stalin, the head of Russia, who murdered all of these people, sent to him by General Eisenhower, never had to spend time in a court facing a charge of being guilty of a war crime against humanity. Don't forget, Russia was on the winning side. Joseph Stalin, a man of peace, friendly, a man who worked for love, for world, killed 6 million people who were sent back to Russia by General Dwight Eisenhower. Now that we've discussed the ending of the World War in Europe, I'd like to now discuss, in the last few minutes before we have to end, the ending of the war with Japan. The war came to an end on August the 14th, 1945, when Japan surrendered. But that nation had tried to surrender. Japan had tried to surrender about 6 months earlier. Japan made peace overtures to Russia. They were not at war with Russia on February the 14th, 1945. America knew about these attempts because we had broken the Japanese war code years before, and we actually heard the messages. In March of 1945, General George Marshall, Chief of Staff, made it clear that he had little faith in the Japanese overtures for peace. So we did not accept their peace offer, and on August the 6th, 1945, America dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. The bomb was called Little Boy, and here's a picture of it, and was constructed of uranium-235. Japan did not surrender, so on August the 9th, 1945, 3 days after Hiroshima, America dropped a second atomic bomb called Fat Man on the Japanese city of Nagasaki. Yes, one bomb and then a second. Why did we drop these 2 atomic bombs? We have been told for years that the reason was that Japan was resisting, and that if American troops invaded Japan, many millions of people would die. That version of history was not accepted at the time by many of America's leaders. We're running out of time. Next week we'll continue with our study of why we dropped the bomb. It was not necessary. Neither bomb had to be dropped. So next week, I invite you to tune us in again as we continue to explore the secrets of history. Thank you very, very much.
a series of lectures exploring the conspiratorial view of history. It is the contention of historian Ralph Epperson that wars, revolutions, and depressions are planned years in advance, and that those who have been involved in the planning of these events have been ensuring that their involvement has been removed from recorded history. It will be Ralph Epperson's purpose to discuss the major events of the past and to remove the veil that has been utilized to cover up the secrets of history.
Welcome to Secrets of History. My name is Ralph Epperson, and I'm the host of this series. Secrets of History is a 24-week lecture series which will explore the conspiratorial view of history. I have been studying the historical view that holds that the major events of the past have been caused intentionally. About 2 years ago, I published my book entitled The Unseen Hand, and there it is. I've subtitled it An Introduction to the Conspiratorial View of History, and there it is, The Unseen Hand. About last week, rather, before I say that, let me say this. Tonight's session is number 22 in the series. Last week we ended in the middle of our discussion on World War II, especially the Pacific, in the Pacific theater with our war against the government of Japan. We discussed the fact that Japan tried to surrender prior to the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs on Japan to end World War II. We were discussing the fact that certain Americans did not believe that it was necessary for us to drop either or both of those atomic bombs. For instance, here's one individual, Admiral William Leahy, who was one of the admirals in the area, said this, number 21, American Admiral. I was of the firm opinion that our war against Japan had progressed to the point where her defeat was only a matter of time and attrition. Now, let me try to explain why he said that, because those who write the accidental view of history tell us that the reason we dropped the 2 bombs was because Japan was going to resist, and if we did invade, millions of Americans were going to lose their life. Here was an admiral, a well-respected admiral, saying it wasn't necessary. All we had to do was almost wait, and the war would come to an end. Last week we also discussed the fact that Japan had tried to surrender months prior to the dropping of the bombs. Our own government didn't believe the story either. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey said this after the war, number 22. Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, and even if no invasion had been planned or contemplated. Now, I believe this is the truth of the matter about the dropping of those 2 bombs. Number 23. It is clear from the events and conversations during the Potsdam Conference that ended the war that the use of the atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki was wanton murder. What is the real reason we dropped the 2 bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the 2 atomic bombs? Why did we drop those bombs? I believe there are 2 reasons. This author, Rose Martin, in this book entitled The Selling of America, and there's the book, by Rose L. Martin, said that she feels there was another reason we dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In her book, Selling of America, Rose Martin said this, number 24. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the chief centers in Japan of a native Christian population. She claims that these 2 cities were selected because they had an extremely high percentage of Christians in those 2 cities. I don't know if she's right or wrong, but it's just interesting if she is right. But there is a far more important reason that I think is far more critical to our understanding of the times. I believe that the bombs were unnecessarily dropped, so that we would fear an atomic war so much that we would be so frightened by the prospect of one, that we would be willing to accept the alternative offered by the conspiracy, the one world government. Let me repeat that. I believe that the bombs were unnecessarily dropped so that we would fear an atomic war so much that we would be so frightened by the prospect of one that we would be willing to accept the alternative offered to us by the conspiracy, a one world government. That's been their goal for 200 years. I want you to remember that each year on the anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing, the press reprints the pictures of the victims. And I want you to remember this, or check it again in I think it's in August, and see if you'll agree with this. You'll not see one picture of any military victims or targets. all you'll see is pictures of civilians. There will be no pictures of burnt or dead soldiers, no generals, no military structures, no tanks, no airplanes destroyed in the attack. The pictures of the civilians are strictly civilians, innocent civilians, not military personnel. These bombs were not dropped on military targets, they were dropped on civilians. Also, there is one other thing I'd like to bring to your attention. America had 2 atomic bombs, so we had to drop 2 atomic bombs. Also, America had 2 different bombs, one constructed of uranium and the other of plutonium. And America didn't know what effect each of those 2 bombs would have on a civilian population. So we dropped 2 bombs on 2 separate populations. Someone else apparently agreed with my assessment that the scientists used these poor Japanese civilians as guinea pigs. That person was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had prepared a speech for delivery on April 13, 1945. Roosevelt had intended to expose openly to the world, number 25, the danger that politicians will accept as inevitable the destruction of innocent people to achieve their goals, and that scientists will concentrate on the means and ignore the ends of their research. What was their research? What was that goal? I believe that that goal was to see what effect radiation would have on human flesh. And I believe that Franklin Roosevelt agreed and was going to tell us that that was their goal. But before he could deliver that speech, he died on April the 12th, 1945. On August the 14th, 1945, Japan surrendered. The war was over. What was the cost of World War II? Number 26. More than 50 million people, 23 million of them in uniform, the rest civilians, were killed, and most of them by horrible deaths. There's a couple of things that I'd like to discuss before we close our study of World War II. I'd like to discuss the question of who the victor was, or who the victors were in World War II. Those who write the Accidental School of History have been telling us for years that the United States won that war, but I don't believe that they did. I believe that Russia, Communist Russia, won the war. One who agreed with me was General Albert Wedemeyer. We've talked about him in the past, who wrote this, number 27. Stalin emerged as the only victor of the war. We, the Allies, ensured the emergence of a more hostile, menacing, predatory power than Nazi Germany, one which has enslaved more people than we liberated. But what was the real purpose of World War II? Why did this conspiracy wage a war that killed 50 million people? They told us as they were fighting it. Let's see if we can see something emerge from the following quotes, starting with number 28. On January the 1st, 1942, the nations at war with the Axis powers formed a wartime coalition by signing, quote, a Declaration of the United Nations. General Douglas MacArthur, when he was appointed the head of our army in the Pacific area, was named number 30, United Nations Commander for the South Pacific. General Eisenhower called D-Day when Allied troops landed in France, number 31, a part of the concerted United Nations plan for the liberation of France. And lastly, on May the 8th, 1945, President Harry Truman said this about the surrender of Germany. German forces have surrendered to the United Nations. Something was going on. They were trying to tell us during the war what the purpose of the war was. All during the war, this conspiracy was telling us something. We are fighting this war to give you a United Nations. That group wasn't formed until October the 24th, 1945, yet all during the early years of the war, they were using that name, the United Nations. Now, a world government needs a world leader, someone to run the world government. Someone was volunteering for the job. Franklin Delano Roosevelt wanted to be the president of the world government. The younger brother of the famous conservationist Gifford Pinchot was named Amos Pinchot. He was a liberal publicist and a Roosevelt supporter. In 1941, he was convinced, 4 years prior to the war ending, Pinchot was convinced, number 32, that Roosevelt envisioned himself as the future omnipotent president of the United States of the world. Roosevelt was hurrying to get to the end of the war as soon as possible because he knew he was dying of cancer. At least I believe so. Fraser Hunt, in his book Douglas MacArthur, on page 380 rather, said this, number 33. The sick and undependable Roosevelt, his already handicapped mind inflamed with grandiose ideas of a world state he would head. Now this is an article that appeared in Time magazine on December the 30th, 1979. It asked the question, did Roosevelt have cancer? The article says that it appears that Roosevelt knew he had cancer in 1944 and chose to run for re-election anyway. Someone who confirmed that Roosevelt was not well in 1944, a year before he died, was Frances Perkins, Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor. And there she is, and here she's her book, a book about her, Madam Secretary Frances Perkins. In that book by George Martin, the author says this, number 34. Yes, the author says, as early as April of 1944, the White House physician, Vice Admiral Ross McIntyre, began lying to everyone about the president's condition, and the press did not seriously challenge him. Now why? Why didn't we have the right to know that Franklin Roosevelt was dying of cancer in 1944 when we were re-electing him for his fourth term? So Roosevelt died before he could achieve his goal, the presidency of the world. But the conspiracy achieved their goal, the United Nations. I'd now like to discuss 4 individuals who I believe discovered this conspiracy and what their goals were and that they wanted a world government. But before they could, I believe that all 4, and we're going to discuss them one at a time, were murdered by this conspiracy. The first individual I'd like to bring to your attention is General George Patton, one of America's successful generals in World War II. Patton felt that he had been hamstrung by his superiors and that those delays had caused unnecessary deaths and had enabled Russia to acquire Eastern Europe. Patton said this, number 1, practically throughout the campaign, I was under wraps from the higher command. I feel that if I had been permitted to go all out, the war would have ended sooner and more lives would have been saved. Patton went on to say, number 2, we are about to replace the Germans with communism. We are going to have to fight the Russians sooner or later, within the next generation, I am sure. If we have to fight them, now is the time. From now on, we, America, will get weaker, and they, Russia, will get stronger. General Patton went on to say what he wanted to do about communism. Number 3, if they will let me fight, I will. But if not, I will resign. I will resign so as to be able to talk and then tell the truth and possibly do my country more good. Patton wanted to tell the truth about how the plans were made for Russia to occupy Central Europe and communize those countries. But he never got the chance to resign. He was going to leave for America on December the 10th, 1945, but he was murdered, I believe, on December the 9th, the day before. Douglas Bazata, an intelligence agent of the OSS for the American government, said he received a contract on Patton's life in 1944. He said that the order had come from Wild Bill Donovan, his boss and the head of the OSS at the time. Bazata told his story in 1979, asked why, after all these years, he was finally willing to tell the truth About this matter, Bezada said that he was 69 years old, in poor health, and wanted the American people to know the truth. The newspaper that broke the story states that, quote, they had a professional analyst subject Bezada's interview to the rigors of a content analysis survey using a psychological stress evaluator called the PSE. His report said this, number 4. The man who tested him said, Bezada gives no evidence of lying, unquote. Bezada claims that Patton was given cyanide. That's what killed him. And the cyanide, rather than the automobile accident that history records as the cause of his death, what finally killed him. The second individual that I believe figured it out was Frank Murphy, an ex-governor of Michigan. President Roosevelt appointed him as an attorney general in 1938, and in 1940 named Frank Murphy to a vacancy on the Supreme Court. This is what the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Frank Murphy said, number 5. We're doomed, he said. The United States is doomed. The communists have control completely. They've got control of Roosevelt and his wife as well. Justice Murphy died a sudden death in a Detroit hospital on the day he was to be discharged as completely recovered. Congressman Martin Dies, for 7 years the chairman of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, was convinced that Frank Murphy had been killed. Third individual I believe was murdered was James Forrestal, a president of the Dillon Reed and Company. In April 1944, James Forrestal was named Secretary of the Navy. And on September the 17th, 1947, he was named Secretary of Defense. On March the 2nd, 1949, he resigned at President Truman's request. James Forrestal said this, number 6, consistency has never been a mark of stupidity. If they were merely stupid, they would occasionally make a mistake in our favor. James Forrestal was alarmed, number 7, by what he took to be Roosevelt's trust in Stalin. Forrestal's nightmare was that capitalism itself was under siege all over the world. During the war, Mr. Forrestal's personal files were filled with the names of journals and organizations and individuals who he considered under communist influence. After Forrestal died, his papers were obtained by the White House, who examined them. They were censored. And then the Department of Defense examined those papers. They were censored. And then they were published in this book entitled The Forrestal Diaries. James Forrestal, and there's the picture of him that we just saw. This book now is available for anybody who wants to read it. You can now read the names of the organizations and individuals that the government wants you to read about. In other words, the book has been heavily censored. We don't know what Mr. Forrestal tried to tell us because the book was censored, and suddenly James Forrestal's got to die, as we're going to see. One of the things that Forrestal talked about that wasn't censored from his book was the Korean War. 15 months before the war started, Forrestal said this, number 8, they're going to catch us unprepared. American soldiers will be dying in a year, he said. Forrestal was correct. The next year, Americans were dying in Korea. I mentioned that Forrestal died. He was taken, actually kidnapped off the streets of Washington and taken to a mental hospital. America's first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, number 9, is said to have jumped to his death from a 16th floor window of the Bethesda Naval Hospital on May the 22nd, 1949. Alleged to be suffering from fatigue due to overwork, he had been held incommunicado, a virtual prisoner, for 7 full weeks when his body was sprawled grotesquely on a third-floor projection of the building. The cord on Forrestal's bathrobe was wound tightly around his neck and tied in a knot. The hospital issued a prepared statement declaring that Secretary Forrestal had committed suicide. This was followed immediately by an almost identical coroner's verdict. It was then discovered that there would be no investigation of his death. Far from being despondent, Forrestal met death less than 12 hours before he was scheduled to be released. While in the hospital, he had not once been allowed to see his priest or family and was looking forward to going home. He was making plans for a book, unaware that President Truman had ordered all of his personal diaries confiscated and locked in a safe at the White House. The official explanation was that Mr. Forrestal had taken the cord from his bathrobe, tied it to the radiator by an exterior window, tied the other end to his neck, and then jumped to his death. It is known that Forrestal did not die from the cord around his neck, but from the fall. And rather untypically for a suicide, he left no suicide note. There is evidence that Forrestal did not commit suicide. 1, there was no mark on the radiator from the cord being tied around it. 2, there was no cord or part of the cord on the radiator. 3, the cord was tightly wrapped around his neck, but there was no evidence it had been tied to the radiator. 4, the cord had not broken. And 5, Mr. Forrestal had been in the Navy and should have been able to tie a secure knot if that was what he did. If he didn't commit suicide, why was he murdered? I believe this is part of the answer. His priest, Monsignor Sheehy, said this, number 10. Many, many times in his letters, Jim Forrestal wrote fearfully of the enormous harm that was unnecessarily being done by men in high office in the United States government who were communists or under the influence of communists, and who he said were shaping the policies of the United States government to aid Soviet Russia and harm the United States. Mr. Forrestal apparently had figured it out. He had the potential and the position to expose this conspiracy, but before he did, he, quote, committed suicide, unquote. If you want to know more about his death, I invite you to read this. I don't think I brought it with me. It's just a book called The Death of James Forrestal by Cornell Simpson. I don't have the book with me, so I just want you to see the name in case you were curious. It will explain how and why James Forrestal was killed. The fourth individual, I believe, was murdered because he discovered the existence of this conspiracy was Senator Joseph McCarthy. Senator McCarthy had been alerted to this conspiracy by Secretary of Defense James Forrestal, who met with him and introduced the subject to the newly elected senator. On June the 14th, 1951, the senator, Joseph McCarthy, said this, number 11, "How can we account for our present situation unless we believe that men high in this government are concerting to deliver us to disaster? This must be the product of a great conspiracy, a conspiracy on a scale so immense as to dwarf any previous such venture in the history of man, a conspiracy of infamy so black that when it is finally exposed, its principles shall be forever deserving of the maledictions of all honest men." The senator continued, "What is the object of this conspiracy? To diminish the United States in world affairs, to weaken us militarily, and to impair our will to resist evil. To what end? To the end that we shall finally fall victim to Soviet intrigue from within and Russian military might from without." It has repeatedly been written that in his zeal to expose this conspiracy, the senator smeared hundreds or thousands of innocent civilians. My 1982 edition of Webster's Dictionary even has a definition pertaining to the senator. It defines McCarthyism as number 12, the use of indiscriminate, often unfounded accusations, ostensibly in the suppression of communism. But if you can prove that the senator ever falsely accused anyone of being a communist that wasn't, you can make yourself $10,000. An organization called, number 13, the Constitutional Education League, offered a $10,000 reward for any person who could prove that Senator McCarthy ever called anyone a communist who in fact was not. No one has ever claimed that reward. No one. In any event, the senator died on May the 2nd, 1957. He died in Bethesda Naval Hospital, the same hospital in which James Forrestal, quote, committed suicide, unquote. It has been alleged that the senator died of complications related to his case of hepatitis. He wasn't in the hospital very long before he died, and that fact hasn't escaped the attention of honest researchers. The author of this book, The Assassination, I don't have the book, I'm sorry. The Assassination of Joseph McCarthy, I don't have it with me, I'm very sorry. The Assassination of Joseph McCarthy is Medford Evans, and he wrote this in the book, number 14. Joe McCarthy's health was such in the spring of 1957 as to make it incredible that he should die so swiftly of natural causes. No autopsy was performed on the body of Senator Joseph McCarthy, so no one knows for sure whether he was murdered or not. I can only say this. The senator knew about this conspiracy. They had every reason to want him dead, and he died a very strange death in a very unusual way. All the signs point to the conclusion that the senator was murdered by this conspiracy because he was in a position to expose it for what it is, a criminal conspiracy against the world. One last thought about the senator, number 15. A note is necessary on the relationship of the Communist Party, McCarthy's declared enemy, as he was theirs, to the American establishment, which is presumably anti-communist and which McCarthy never attacked, but which attacked him and was indeed more immediately the instrument of his destruction than was the Communist Party. The senator was not destroyed by the communists. The senator was destroyed by the establishment in cooperation with the media, and he never attacked the establishment. I'd like to now change the subject in the direction for a little while and discuss the business of creating your own enemy. You might remember America's Civil War, when this conspiracy actually created the southern states, the Confederacy, as an enemy for the North, the American government. This process of creating an enemy is still going on. The American government has created the Russian enemy, and this process has been going on for over 70 years. Why? One who answered this question was historian Edward Gibbon in his book entitled Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He listed 5 reasons why the Roman government fell. Number 16, increase in divorce, undermining the family. 2, higher taxes for bread and circuses. 3, a drive for pleasure, sports becoming more exciting and brutal. 4, loss of faith, and this is the key, number 5, gigantic armaments for external enemy when the real enemy was internal. The Roman government had created its own enemy. All the while the conspiracy inside was eating away at the government. This is a common strategy. Divert the attention of the public from the real danger by focusing on an enemy that the government has created. This is what makes magic work. Your attention is drawn away from the real action by an act of deception, and creating an enemy serves the same function. We've discussed this book before, The Report from Iron Mountain, and there it is, on the possibility and desirability of peace. Report from Iron Mountain. This book is going to tell us why nations create their own enemy. The Report from Iron Mountain says this, number 17. The existence of an accepted external menace is essential to the acceptance of political authority. We, the dumb people, will accept more governmental control of our affairs during a period of war. But not just any enemy will do. It's very important for you to pick the right enemy. The menace you create, number 18, must be believable. It must be believable. Number 19, it must be of a magnitude consistent with the complexity of the society threatened. And number 20, it must appear to affect the entire society. Those quotes came right out of the book, The Report from Iron Mountain. Now here's the way it works. We've described the pincers movement before in this series, quite often I think. In this case, the mob on the bottom is the Russian Communist government. And the bigger they become, the more we demand of government to solve the problem. The thing we don't know is that it has been the government that has been constructing the enemy, in this case, Soviet Communist Russia. Now, why did the conspiracy choose Russia? Because it has approximately the same population as the United States. Germany would not be big enough. Neither would France, England, or Brazil. And China is too big. By the way, that's why this conspiracy created the mythical Chinese-Soviet split. We talked about that several weeks ago. To keep the enemy of a manageable size, we might have to negotiate more rather than spend billions of dollars to build our defenses. This is Dr. Anthony Sutton without an H, I should say, one of the finest researchers into the evidence that the American government has constructed Russia's communist enemy. He wrote this book entitled National Suicide. There's my copy of it, rather beat up. Military Aid to the Soviet Union. He wrote that book in 1973. Sutton has written numerous books on this subject of aid and trade to the Russian government. This is what he wrote about that trade, number 21. There is no such thing as Soviet technology. Almost all, perhaps 90 to 95%, came from the United States and its allies. In effect, the United States and the NATO countries have built the Soviet Union, its industrial and military capabilities. Mr. Sutton updated his research when he released this book entitled The Best Enemy Money Can Buy. He wrote that book just 2 years ago, 1986. This book also discusses America's aid and trade to Russia. The following is a 3-sentence summary of what Dr. Sutton discovered, number 22. Dr. Sutton said, the United States financed the economic and military development of the Soviet Union. Without this aid, financed by U.S. taxpayers, there would be no Soviet economy to support the Soviet military machine, let alone sophisticated military equipment. But I know what you're saying. Communist Russia doesn't need any assistance from the West. We've read comments like this one before from Mikhail Gorbachev, the Russian premier, who said this last year, 1987, number 23. The socialist, meaning the communist system, has demonstrated repeatedly its advantages over capitalism. This is not boasting, but a hard fact, he said. Now, who do we believe? Gorbachev or Sutton? Are there any others who might be able to help us answer that question? Zadislaw Ruraz, that's the best I can do, it's a Polish name, but that man was Communist Poland's ambassador to Japan until 1981. This is what he said, number 24. I have spent most of my career in the international trade arena, and I know how absolutely necessary trade with the West is to the Communist bloc. Without it, they could not sustain their economies, and they certainly could not continue to support the Soviet armaments buildup that now threatens the entire world. I believe that Dr. Sutton and the ambassador to Poland are correct. Ambassador from Poland to Japan. Communism is a fraud. Communism has always been a fraud, and communism will always be a fraud. The question should be, do the communists know that the system is a fraud? Do they know that it doesn't work? Yes. The communists know that the system does not work, as I'm going to show you. What then is keeping communism alive if it doesn't work? The aid and trade from the United States. Without this transfer of technology, communism around the world as we know it would simply disappear. But the communists believe the American capitalist is an exploiter of the masses, an enemy of the working class, an opponent of the revolution. Why would the communists want to trade with the dreaded capitalists? Because some of the communists know that the communists and capitalists are not enemies, but are allies. Some of the communists know that the capitalists are their bosses, and therefore those bosses call the tune. If they say, we trade, then we trade. But this alliance poses a real problem. How do those communists who understand how the game is played keep knowledge of the plan away from the communists who don't know how the game is being played. It's very obvious to the dumb communists that something is wrong when the hated capitalist shows up in Russia to build factories, stores, railroads, and hydroelectric plants. Those communists who do understand the game plan have got some real explaining to do to those that don't understand the plan. So what those communists do that do know is cover up the truth with lies. They tell their fellow communists that they are using the capitalists. The capitalists are so dumb, according to their logic, that they don't know that they'll be building communism so that the communists can crush them in a worldwide revolution in the future. Nikolai Lenin, the first communist dictator in Russia, said this, number 25. When the time comes for us to hang the capitalists, they will compete with each other for the profits of selling us the rope. The capitalists will furnish credits, and by supplying us with materials and techniques which are not available to us, they will rebuild our war industry, which is essential to our future attacks on our own suppliers. In other words, they will be laboring to prepare their own suicides. Joseph Stalin, the second communist dictator in Russia, told us why they needed this technology. He said this, number 26. Unless such aid is forthcoming, it will be impossible to bring the various nations and peoples within a single world economic system that is so essential to the final triumph of socialism, meaning communism. Leonid Brezhnev, one of the more recent Russian communist dictators, said this in 1973, number 27. We communists have got to string along with the capitalists for a while. We need their credits. We need their credits, their agriculture, and their technology. Notice from the earliest days of the communist revolutions, the revolution, singular, meaning just one, in 1917 to 1973, the communists themselves admit that they have needed Western assistance and technology to survive. That's 56 years of American assistance. I'd like to go back now to the Russian Revolution of 1917 to 1920. Russia's industry had been severely damaged not only by the revolution but also by her involvement in World War I. H.G. Wells, the author, toured Russia in 1920 and said this, number 28. Russia presented an unparalleled example of civilization in a state of complete collapse. Someone had to rebuild the nation. And there were some very wealthy volunteers, American and European capitalists, offered to rebuild Russia. Lenin, the communist dictator, established the Soviet trade policy of number 29, acquaintance with European and American technology. Moscow must have one specimen of all the most important machines from among the latest in order to learn and to instruct. So the Russians started importing Western technology. The original trade between these two nations was for, quote, peaceful trade, peaceful purposes, unquote. American engineering firms went to Russia and built tractor factories. These factories were intended to be used in producing additional farm products. Now this is a picture of the Stalingrad tractor factory. American technicians actually built this factory and then taught the Russians to operate the machinery. I'd like to show you some of the products, these farm tractors, of these factories that were constructed by these American companies. I'd like to show you 7 pictures of these tractors taken from nations all over the world. Russia wanted to share their bounty with other nations so that they have exported these tractors to other countries. Isn't that wonderful? They want others to grow food, so they export tractors all over the world. The first picture I want to show you is of a farm tractor built by an American company. And this was taken of this tractor in Moscow. There's the tractor in Moscow. The second picture is of a tractor in India. And there we see the tractor in India. The third picture is of a tractor in Afghanistan. There we see the tractor in Afghanistan. The next picture is of a farm tractor in Angola, Africa. And the next picture is of a series of tractors in Czechoslovakia, apparently waiting for the farmers to come pick them up. The next picture is of a captured Soviet tractor in Afghanistan. Apparently the Soviet who owned the tractor didn't make his payments. And the last picture is of 3 tractors in Rhodesia. As you can see, these tractors are clearing a field for plowing. Isn't that wonderful? Each of those tractors that we just saw all over the world were built in American-built, quote, tractor factories, unquote, and sold by them to the Russian people, and told the American people that we were doing this because we wanted to send peaceful trade to the Russians. Obviously, those pictures were not pictures of tractors. They were pictures of tanks or armored personnel carriers. But each of those vehicles was built in a factory constructed by an American engineering company. Dr. Sutton has written this, number 30. The tractor plants at Stalingrad, Krakow or something, and Chelyabinsk, erected with Western assistance and equipment, were used from the start to produce tanks, armored cars, and self-propelled guns. Notice that Dr. Sutton said that these factories were used from the start to produce tractors that looked like tanks. Those who built those factories must have known that the Russians were not going to build tractors. I'd like to offer you an American eyewitness to the fact that American firms built these factories. This is Walter Reuther, president at one time of the United Auto Workers and a vice president of the AFL-CIO. And he went to Russia for 18 months and worked in an automobile factory that was supposed to turn out automobiles. That factory that Walter Reuther worked in was constructed by Henry Ford, the American automobile manufacturer, in the Russian city of Gorky. While in Russia, Mr. Reuther wrote a letter to Melvin Bishop, a close friend of his, in Detroit. Mr. Reuther wrote this, number 31. The daily inspiration that is ours as we work side by side with our Russian comrades in our factory is the compensation we receive for our temporary absence from the struggle in the United States. And then the letter ended with this comment, carry on the fight for a Soviet America. This is a photograph of a part of the communist paper, the Daily Worker, for September the 4th, 1937, and it shows the 3 Reuther brothers with Walter on the right. Their article was favorably commenting on the 3 Reuther brothers, Walter being one of the 3. Going back to Mr. Sutton, he further explained, or back to Dr. Sutton rather, he further explained that our government knew in advance that these factories were going to be used for military purposes. He wrote this, number 32. Washington also knows that Soviet industrialization has been preeminently Soviet militarization. The first priority in Soviet industrial plans was given to the military departments. Indeed, the original drive behind Russia's industrialization was military. This objective was clearly stated in 1929 by a man by the name of Unischlicht, I guess, the vice president of the Revolutionary Military Soviet, before American firms went into Russia to carry out the 5-year plans. Here's what Unischlicht said, the vice president of the Revolutionary Military Soviet. We must try to ensure that industry can as quickly as possible be adapted to serving military needs. And for those who say that we can control how the Russians utilize this technology, I'd like to quote Lawrence J. Brady, an official from the Department of Commerce of the United States. He said this, number 33. It is virtually impossible to ensure that the advanced technology equipment shipped to the Soviet Union is not diverted to military purposes. We can't know how that stuff is used. There's no way to protect us to make sure it's used for, quote, peaceful purposes, unquote. The Soviet Union has 2 major steel plants. This one is at Magnitogorsk, Russia. It was built in March of 1930 by the Arthur G. McKee and Company of Cleveland, Ohio, and is a duplicate, I'm told, of the one in Gary, Indiana. The other steel plant is at Kuznetsk, and it was built by the Frayne Engineering Company of Chicago. Russia's oil production facilities were also constructed by American petroleum interests. You might remember that Russia's oil production was controlled by the Nobel family and the Rothschilds until the Russian Revolution of 1917. Prior to that date, Russia was the world's largest producer and exporter of oil. In 1923, after the Communist Revolution, the Nobels and the Rothschilds left, and Nikolai Lenin, the communist head of the government, gave oil boring concessions to number 34, Standard Oil, Campari Oil Company of New Jersey, and Royal Dutch Shell. Those are the companies that got the rights to drill in Russia for oil. In 1929, 1930, and 1931, the Winkler-Cook Engineering Company, of Wichita, Kansas, built 15 oil refineries in Russia. In addition, Standard Oil got a concession to build a 150,000-ton kerosene plant and also a 100-octane gasoline refinery. In 1960, to show you how we've not been told the truth about our trade with Russia, number 35, an American petroleum industry delegation visited Russia and was shown 4 refineries in August of 1960. 3 of these refineries were World War II Lend-Lease refineries, and the 4th was either a Lend-Lease refinery or a Soviet copy of a U.S. installation. In other words, our free press has not told us the truth, so Russia can fool us about their oil refineries, and even our own oil people don't know the truth. Russia has the largest navy and merchant marine in the world. Anthony Sutton tells us this, number 36. All shipbuilding technology in the USSR comes directly or indirectly from the U.S. or its NATO allies. Almost 70% of the present Soviet merchant fleet has been built outside the Soviet Union. The largest free world suppliers of ships to the Soviet fleet have been America's, quote, allies, unquote, Japan and West Germany. Our own allies have been building Russia's ships. Isn't that nice? On May the 25th, 1983, just a couple of years ago, John Lehman, Secretary of the Navy, told the graduating class at Annapolis, number 37, within weeks, many of you will be looking across hundreds of feet of water at some of the most modern technology ever invented in America. Unfortunately, that technology, the most modern ever invented in America, is on Soviet ships. Secretary Lehman had figured it out. Russia's Navy is stamped, made in the USA, or at least in the West. World War II gave World War II gave America an excuse to really help Russia after Germany attacked in 1941. The program of assistance between our government and the Russian government was called Lend-Lease. The American government loaned Russia $11 billion worth of equipment to assist them in defeating Germany. Notice that I said America loaned these items to Russia. They were supposed to return them or to buy them, yet they never did until President Nixon allowed the Russians to pay off this debt some 30 years later at about 20 cents on the dollar. President Roosevelt, on March the 7th, 1942, issued a directive to every government agency concerned to give priority in this Lend-Lease program to shipments to Russia. Number 38, without regard to the effect of these shipments on any other part of the war program. Russia did not get preferential treatment, however, but they did get second choice even over American troops in the Pacific theater in the war against Japan. This was America's priority list for our goods to help fighting people against Germany during the war, number 39. First on the list to get priority was the European theater. Secondly, Russia was to get second priority. Third, the Pacific theater. Our fighting men in the Japanese war against Japan in the Pacific got third priority after Russia. And fourth, our ally China got fourth priority. Now, what did we send to Russia in our Lend-Lease program? Number 40, cargo vessels, naval guns, petroleum refineries, patents on bomb sites, tanks, airplanes, and bullet-resisting armor. 5, synthetic rubber factories, dynamite, bombers, fighters, tanks, trucks, and trailers. And that's only a partial list. We built Russia's war machine during World War II. And they did receive every assistance on new inventions. Major General John Dean, who was secretary to the combined chiefs of staff during part of the war, said this, number 41. Our policy of Franklin Roosevelt was to make our new inventions in electronics and other fields available to Russia. One of those new inventions that we gave to Russia during World War II was the atomic bomb. Those who write the Accidental School of History have attempted to explain how Russia got the bomb by accusing Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. This team was executed in June of 1953 for their role in transferring the secrets of the bomb to Russia. The judge who sentenced the Rosenberg said this, number 42. Your conduct in putting into the hands of the Russians the atomic bomb has already caused the communist aggression in Korea. By your betrayal, you have altered the course of history to the disadvantage of our country. But the Rosenbergs were not the guilty ones for giving the atomic bomb to Russia. Someone else had delivered the bomb to Russia and beat him to the punch. Someone else had betrayed America. That someone who gave the bomb to Russia was President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This is James Roosevelt, the son of the president, and he's written a book that tells how he was ordered by his father, we'll come to the book in a minute, to turn the secrets of the atomic bomb over to the Russians. That book, and there it is called A Family Matter. This book tells how James Roosevelt was ordered by his father, there in the bottom you can see it's by him, how he was ordered to give the atomic bomb to the Russians. The review of this book by the New York Times said this about the book, A Family Matter, number 43. The White House is to progressively leak to Stalin step-by-step plans to build the atomic bomb. In return, the Premier Stalin is to support a post-war United Nations. Now, I want to be fair and point out that Roosevelt's book is a novel, not a book of nonfiction, which implies that the book is not true. But I want to read the last paragraph of the dust cover on the book. It says this, number 44. James Roosevelt, the son of Franklin, has written a novel of spine-chilling drama and, notice the word, authenticity. Number 45. Authentic is defined as being true or genuine. Roosevelt's book is authentic or true. Could President Roosevelt have authorized the transfer of the atomic bomb to Russia during World War II? The answer is an unqualified yes. The Lend-Lease Agreement between the United States and Russia said, number 46, the United States will supply the Soviet Union with such defense articles as the President shall authorize to be transferred. So Roosevelt had the authority to send the plans, the materials for the atomic bomb to Russia under the Lend-Lease Agreement. If his book is true, then why didn't James Roosevelt, call his book nonfiction? I can't answer that question, but I can give you an opinion. If you'll remember that the Rosenbergs were executed for doing the same thing that Roosevelt did, then I can understand why Roosevelt would not want to confess his crime directly to the American public. Why did Roosevelt write the book in the first place? Once again, I can't answer that question. All I know is that he did write the book and that the book is authentic or true. The reason I believe that the book is true is because Roosevelt's book confirms this little book called From Major Jordan's Diaries by George Racy Jordan. There it is, little paperback. George Racy Jordan was sent to Great Falls, Montana on May the 10th, 1942 to expedite America's Lend-Lease program to Russia. The Army Air Base at Great Falls, Montana, was the receiving station for Lend-Lease goods that could be flown out of America. Jordan was curious as to what we were sending Russia, so he opened the boxes and the diplomatic pouches and looked inside. He kept diaries and listed the goods being sent to Russia. In one suitcase, he found papers with the words Manhattan Engineering District. That was the name of the project developing the atomic bomb. The pages had words like number 47, cyclotron, proton, deuteron, uranium, fission, and flying neutrons. Now, Jordan didn't know what those words meant. This was 1943, don't forget. But he made notes in his diaries. Not only did he find these papers, but he also found evidence that we sent uranium to Russia. He says in his book, number 48, the United States sent Russia at least 3 consignments of uranium chemicals, nearly 3/4 of a ton. Confirmed also was the shipment of 1 kilogram or 2.2 pounds of uranium metal at the time when the total American stock was only 4.5 pounds. We sent them half of our U-235. All of this had no significance until September the 23rd, 1949, when Russia announced that they had exploded an atomic bomb. So suddenly, Jordan started remembering. He took his story to Congress, but few inside Congress were listening because nothing was done. Here's what Major Jordan said about his treatment by the American people that he had tried to tell the truth to. Number 49. Despite the fact that I had documents to verify every phase of my story, not only my own diary, but complete and original bills of lading, every attempt was made to discredit everything I had to say. I found, much to my amazement, that even after my story was proven beyond any shadow of a doubt, some of the leading writers and commentators distorted the facts. I was vilified, abused, and smeared. Life magazine added another part of the puzzle. In this article they published on October the 3rd, 1949. It says that America allowed Russia to obtain a cyclotron at the end of World War II. It says, number 50, in May 1945, 3 months before the first bomb was dropped, Russians beat Americans to the punch and carried off the cyclotron in the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. We're running out of time, so next week we'll continue our discussion of how our government gave Russia the atomic bomb, blamed the Rosenbergs, and allowed the Roosevelts to go unchallenged. I invite you next week to tune us in again as we continue to explore the secrets of history. Thank you so very, very much.
The conspiratorial view of history. It is the contention of historian Ralph Epperson that wars, revolutions, and depressions are planned years in advance, and that those who have been involved in the planning of these events have been ensuring that their involvement has been removed from recorded history. It will be Ralph Epperson's purpose to discuss the major events of the past and to remove the veil that has been utilized to cover up the secrets of history.
Welcome to Secrets of History. My name is Ralph Epperson, and I am the host of this series. Secrets of History is a 24-week lecture series which will explore the conspiratorial view of history. I have been studying the historical view that holds that the major events of the past have been caused intentionally. About 2 years ago, I published my book, after I wrote it, entitled The Unseen Hand. I've subtitled it An Introduction to the Conspiratorial View of History, and there it is. Tonight's session is number 23 in the series, and we're going to continue our discussion of how our government gave Russia the atomic bomb. Last week we started that discussion that America has constructed Russia's military machine. Included in that discussion, as I just said, was the evidence that President Franklin Roosevelt gave Russia the atomic bomb in 1944. As we ended the program, I was discussing the fact that America actually gave the Soviet Union Germany's cyclotron, and that's where we're going to pick up our story tonight. At the end of World War II, when our government actually allowed the Soviet Union to take Germany's cyclotron. You might remember that the American government actually allowed Russia to enter Berlin before we did at the end of World War II. They actually ordered American troops to wait while the Russians moved west. That means that we could have attained the cyclotron, but we apparently wanted Russia to have it. There's one last thing I'd like to place into the puzzle, and that is this article that appeared in the Wall Street Journal on April the 25th, 1975. It's a negative of the article taken off of a microfilmed copy of the Wall Street Journal. The headline reads, number 51, U.S. quietly allows uranium shipments to Soviet Union for processing into fuel. The article says that America sent, number 52, 1.4 million pounds of uranium oxide to Russia for processing into uranium-235, the power for nuclear plants and for the atomic bomb. Notice that the article said that the U-235 that we sent them is for Russia's atomic bombs. Now, what did we do that for? Is our government insane? It doesn't make sense to send your enemy the material it needs to blow your nation off of the face of the earth, but that's what we did. But maybe I'm exaggerating the peril. Maybe I'm making more of this than the evidence merits. Let me quote Jake Garn, an American senator who told us how significant this trade is. He told us, number 53, the Soviets have applied these acquisitions to their military to the point where virtually every new Soviet weapon system is produced, at least in part with the aid of modern technology or equipment acquired from the West. How much aid have we sent to Russia in their 60-some years? Senator William Armstrong said this in 1982, number 54. In the last 10 years alone, the United States and other Western nations have sold to the Soviet Union and its satellites more than $50 billion worth of sophisticated technical equipment the communists could not produce themselves. This equipment has been used to produce nuclear missiles, tanks and armored cars, military control systems, spy satellites, and air defense radars. Yes, you might say, at least America has made some money on the sale of this technology. That statement is not true. We sell this technology on credit. One of the few who have commented on this strange business is Senator Barry Goldwater, who has figured it out. Here's what he said, number 55. When we sell the Russians, they don't pay us in cash. The deal is accomplished with the system of credits. We lend the money under very favorable terms. If the borrower doesn't make his payments, the taxpayer is stuck. In other words, we've been financing our own enemy. I'd like to now discuss the Export-Import Bank, the federal agency that makes or guarantees loans to the Soviet Union. This bank was created on February the 2nd, 1934, by an executive order issued by President Franklin Roosevelt. Critics have correctly pointed out that President Roosevelt had no constitutional authority to create this bank, but he did it anyway. In 1974, the General Accounting Office, a congressional agency, ruled that the bank was breaking a 1968 law, which, number 56, forbids credit extensions to communist countries unless the president informs Congress that it is in, quote, the national interest, unquote. So the president has but to simply declare it to be the nation's best interest. Number one, here, let me show you this. Here, for instance, is the president's determination of the presidential determination of President Richard Nixon on October the 18th, 1972. It reads in part, number 57. I hereby determine that it is in the national interest for the Export-Import Bank to guarantee, insure, extend credit, and participate in the extension of credit in connection with the purchase or lease of any product or service by, for use in, or the sale, or for the sale, or lease to the Soviet Union. And then it was signed by Richard Nixon. Notice, President Nixon said it was in this nation's best interest to extend credit to Russia to buy American goods. It is in this nation's interest to trade with our enemy. Let me give you just one example of how this bank works. This is an article that appeared in the Portland Oregonian on May the 22nd, 1974. The headline reads, U.S. grants Soviet $180 million loan. The article reads in part, number 57. The U.S. Export-Import Bank granted a $180 million loan to the Soviet Union to help finance construction of a huge fertilizer complex. By the way, fertilizer complexes also make explosives. Just how important is this Export-Import Bank, number 58? From mid-1972 to mid-1974, the Export-Import Bank made available $469 million to enable the Russians to buy machinery, foundries, and factory equipment, all long-term loans extended at interest rates of 6%, at a time when American homebuyers and businessmen had to pay 9 to 12%. But that was in 1974. Is this aid in trade still continuing? And does our government still approve of this aid in trade? In 1985, the U.S. Department of Defense issued a report entitled number 59, Soviet Acquisition of Militarily Significant Western Technology and Update. This is what the report said, number 60, in part. In recent years, the United States government has learned of a massive, well-organized campaign by the Soviet Union to acquire Western technology illegally and, notice, legally, for its weapons and military equipment projects. Notice they're doing it legally. Each year, Moscow receives thousands of pieces of Western equipment and many tens of thousands of unclassified and classified, notice, even classified documents are sent to the Soviet Union as part of this campaign. Virtually every Soviet military research project, well over 4,000 each year in the late 1970s and over 5,000 in the early 1980s, benefits from these technical documents and hardware. The assimilation of Western technology is so broad that the United States and other Western nations are thus subsidizing the Soviet military buildup. In other words, our own government admits how significant this aid and trade is. It said that nearly every Soviet military project benefits from this technology transfer. Nearly every project. But what if a private citizen figures it out and tries to put a stop to this transfer? Will he be hailed as a true American patriot? Will he be given a medal by Congress? Another department of the government tried to answer these questions. In 1966, the State Department issued this, and I had to make a copy of it. It's simply entitled, let me get the shiny plastic up out of the way. It's simply entitled, Private Boycotts versus the National Interest. It was published by the State Department in 1966, and in it, it asked this question, number 61. Is it illegal or unpatriotic for Americans to sell peaceful goods to the communist countries of Eastern Europe? And this is what our State Department answered. A small but active minority apparently believes it is unpatriotic to trade with a communist country. Then it asks another question. Are these Americans, meaning those who protest this policy, advancing the interests of the United States? The government of the United States does not believe so. On the contrary, it believes they are harming the United States national interest by obstructing a foreign policy that has been developed, and please notice this, it has been developed by 4 administrations since World War II. In other words, the government admits that this aid and trade is desirable, even though another branch says that it has built Russia's military power. And if you object and try to prevent this aid and trade, you are, quote, harming the national interest, unquote. In 1981, the Commerce Department issued a 57-page pamphlet entitled number 62, Sales Promotion Techniques for Marketing in Communist Countries. The report said, number 63, the Department of Commerce promotes and encourages the expansion of trade between the United States and the USSR. trade relations with these countries is in the United States' national interests. But surely the conservative Ronald Reagan, as president, would object and put a stop to it, because that's the conservative position. He ran on the 1980 Republican Party platform that said, in part, number 64, Republicans, meaning me, Ronald Reagan, pledged to stop the flow of technology to the Soviet Union. And Reagan admitted that the Soviet Union did not have a good goal. In March of 1981, Ronald Reagan said, number 65, I know of no leader of the Soviet Union since the revolution, meaning 1917, including the present leadership, that has not repeated that their goal must be world revolution and a one-world communist state. And on December the 10th, 1986, Ronald Reagan signed another Human Rights Day proclamation. He criticized the Kremlin for, number 66, quote, its systematic violation of human rights. He said, quote, we will continue to do our utmost to press for change, unquote. And you might remember that President Reagan called Russia, number 67, the evil empire, unquote. 1 month after the Russian government shot down the Korean airliner in September of 1983, Ronald Reagan, number 68, insisted that his administration had slowed the transfer of free world technology to the Soviets. So President Reagan surely must have done something to stop it. Let's just see whether he did. On October the 9th, 1983, the New York Times columnist William Safire wrote this, number 69. When it comes to the transfer of valuable free world technology that will strategically benefit the Soviet Union, it was during the Reagan administration that the floodgates were opened. Trade magazine wrote this on September the 6th, 1981, number 70. The process of technology transfer from the U.S. to the Soviet Union is continuing under the Reagan administration. Something is wrong. Here are some of the items approved by the Reagan administration for export to Russia in 1982, number 71. We sent Russia communications equipment, electronic computing equipment, integrated circuits, laser equipment, gear grinding machines, aircraft and parts, and petroleum equipment. Not only is President Ronald Reagan sending this technology to Russia, he is encouraging American businessmen to sell their goods to Russia. On August the 10th, 1987, President Ronald Reagan named C. William Verity as Secretary of Commerce. Verity is a member of the USSR, U.S. Trade and Economic Council, which he helped launch in 1973. That group is a strong advocate of aid and trade with Russia. Let me give you a little sketch of this organization. The USSR Trade and Economic Council, called simply the TEC, was formed in 1973, as I just said. Originally, it was an organization of 25 Fortune 500 businessmen from America and 25 top Soviet officials. It was dedicated to the expansion of trade between the two nations. Its directors included David Rockefeller, and here he is, America's leading banker, and Armand Hammer, an extremely rich industrialist. Now, this group has over 300 members. But the TEC won't tell us who their members are. Isn't that interesting? Moscow knows and Washington knows, but only the American people are not to know. Two of its permanent directors are Alexander Trowbridge, president of the National Association of Manufacturers, and Richard Lesher, president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The council has 8 full-time engineers living in New York City. Their job is to select U.S. technology for use by the Soviet military and arrange for the transfer to Russia. The TEC publishes a bi-monthly magazine called The Journal. Volume 9, number 3 of this journal contained a letter from President Ronald Reagan. Don't forget, I'm going to stop this aid and trade. We Republicans promise it. Reagan wrote, number 72, I appreciate the opportunity to welcome the Soviets in the plenary, meaning the fully attended session of the TEC. volume number 11 rather, number 1 of the journal, printed another letter from President Ronald Reagan dated December the 6th, 1985. That letter read, number 73, I am pleased to greet the U.S.-USSR Trade and Economic Council as you convene in Moscow. Could President Reagan stop the aid and trade if he wanted to? If President Reagan truly wanted to support the 1980 Republican Party platform that promised us that he would end the aid and trade, if President Reagan truly believed that Russia was indeed an evil empire, yes, he can. President Reagan has the power to stop this aid and trade if he truly wanted to stop the aid and trade. This is an article that appeared in 1987 that says that President Reagan ordered a ban of all trade with Iran. If President Reagan can ban trade with Iran, he can ban trade with Russia. I think it is fair to conclude that President Ronald Reagan supports the building of America's enemy. He does not believe that Russia is an evil empire. I'd now like to explore some actual instances where the technology we transferred to Russia came back to actually kill Americans. The first example I'd like to discuss is the Korean War of 1950 to 1953. During the Korean War, the two sides used the latest in airplane technology. The Americans used the F-86 jet, the plane on the left, and the North Koreans used the MiG-15, the plane on the right. Many people commented that the two planes looked a great deal alike. That was because the two jets were designed by the same man. The two planes were products of the design of Dr. Siegfried Gunther, the German who had been working on the jet airplane for Nazi Germany since 1939. After the war, Dr. Gunther went to work for the Americans, who at first refused to consider his airplane as legitimate. The doctor went to East Germany, and there he was kidnapped by the Russians and taken to Moscow. There, in Moscow, Dr. Gunther's designs became the MiG-15. Finally, America caught on, and in the United States, his plans became the F-86. But the story is even more interesting. The MiG-15 used in Korea to shoot down Americans was powered by a Rolls-Royce engine. The Russians in 1973, I believe it was, purchased 55 Rolls-Royce jet engines in 1947 from England, and the engines were copies of the Russians made copies of them, and those were installed in the MiG-15. So it was our so-called ally, England, that killed American pilots in the Korean War. This story was confirmed in 1977 when Parade magazine issued a report that told its readers, in 1947, the British government made the mistake of selling 55, of selling 55 Rolls-Royce engines to the Soviets against the advice of its intelligence experts. The Soviets immediately began reproducing the engine illegally for their fighters. It was these fighters that were sent to North Korea to fight against U.S. aircraft in the Korean War. But the Parade magazine article revealed a far more damaging sale that was being considered by the English. They were considering the sale of the Rolls-Royce RB211 jet engine that provides 50,000 pounds of thrust for the use in jumbo jets. As I remember, the English did not sell Russia the large jet engines because General Electric wanted to. GE wanted to sell Russia their CF6 jet engine, capable of producing 50,000 pounds of thrust. America uses the CF6 in the 747 jet airplane and in the C-5A, the world's largest cargo plane, and by the way, a military airplane. As I remember, GE was not permitted to sell the jet engines to Russia because some congressmen would not allow the government to sell them, to allow the sale rather. But Rolls-Royce is still selling its jet engines to communist nations. In November of 1977, China produced a new jet fighter, the F-12, which will be powered by Rolls-Royce jet engines. By the way, the United States has the power to stop the sale of these jet engines through its NATO commitments with England. we could tell them, you have no authority by treaty, and England could not sell them. But we've done nothing. But the worst example of the aid and trade between the United States and the Soviet Union occurred during the Vietnamese War. To understand why our government supplied the enemy with the material to kill the American fighting man, we must go back to World War II. As the war with Japan was winding down in the Pacific Theater, American soldiers were capturing huge quantities of Japanese arms, ammunition, medical supplies, radios, and food. Our Secret Service then hired Ho Chi Minh as an American intelligence agent and turned some of the captured Japanese goods over to him. In 1973, Parade magazine published an article entitled, "When Ho Chi Minh Was an Intelligence Agent for the United States." The author of the report was Lloyd Shearer, who quoted Charles Fenn, the man who recruited Ho, as an American intelligence agent, and Charles Fenn said this, number 2. "We had a trusted agent whom we regularly supplied with weapons, radio equipment, operators, and medicine. All of it served to reinforce his position and status. Our government hired Ho Chi Minh even though they knew he was a trained communist. He had been trained in Moscow, Russia, by the Russian communists and was an admitted Marxist communist. In other words, the American government was supplying a known communist with the weapons to create a communist revolution in Vietnam. This assistance to Ho Chi Minh was further explained in this article issued by Parade magazine on June the 20th, 1982. It reads in part, number 3, during the Vietnamese War, America's #1 enemy was Ho Chi Minh, but only two decades later, the U.S. hardly supported the Vietnamese leader and his red, meaning communist followers. General Philip E. Gallagher, a U.S. advisor to the Chinese Army, arrived in Vietnam in the summer of 1945 and established a warm rapport with Ho. His speech at a rally in Hanoi that October was broadcast over Viet Minh radio. Our government started sending, quote, military advisors, unquote, to Vietnam to assist the government of South Vietnam in their war against the North Vietnamese. The number of these advisors was steadily being increased until President John Kennedy decided to pull all